So our next speaker is Lydia Wong, and she'll be presenting on her work, Nesting Resource Limitation, Determinants of Elevation Range Limits in Cavity Nesting Bees.
So hi everyone, my name is Lydia, and I'll be talking about some of the work I've been doing from the Forest Lab at U Ottawa, looking at elevational range limits in cavity nesting bees and thinking about the possibility of range shifts. And I'll start by saying range shifts, both latitudinal and elevational, are one of the most commonly documented biological responses to changes in climate. This is something that's been observed in all kinds of organisms, and that includes bees. Now, some of this work includes realized range shifts, so shifts that have already occurred, and typically we document these either using museum records or by resurveying an area that's been surveyed historically. But some of this work is also predictive. Essentially, we use species distribution models to predict how the ranges of bees might change in the future given their current distributions in different climate scenarios. And what we're assuming here is that ranges might shift or need to shift based on the thermal tolerances of species. And I think generally this is a robust assumption to make, given that for the most part, species ranges do reflect their climatic niches. And yet, very often, we don't actually end up seeing species conforming to the predictions we make about range shifts. This seems to be the case for a number of different organisms, but also in bees. Either their ranges don't shift as rapidly as we would expect given the rate of climate change, or they even shift in directions counter to what we would expect. And so when we see this, well, we might wonder if there could be more specific habitat variables that are limiting the ranges of organisms, because even though climate variables like temperature and precipitation might determine a species' range limit at very broad spatial scales, at more local spatial scales, species are interacting with other species, they need to find food, and they might have a whole bunch of other habitat requirements that they need to meet before they can successfully establish a population beyond their range. And so all that's to say is that a species range might reflect a lot more than just broad scale climate variables if we're thinking more locally. Now, the most commonly used way to identify if there are local variables limiting range shifts in organisms is to do a transplant experiment. And so put very simply, we take the organism of interest and we bring it to a locality beyond what we know to be their current range limit. And then we see if they can survive and reproduce. And oftentimes what we can do is couple these transplant experiments with experimental manipulations, and that can help us identify if there are local environmental variables that might be precluding their establishment beyond their current range. And so let's say maybe we manipulate their access to food resources to determine if that's a limiting factor. Now, it's generally okay to do transplant experiments with plants and other sessile organisms because they're not going to walk away after being transplanted. But maybe it's less okay to do that with non-sessile organisms like bees, in part for reasons concerning artificial gene flow and accidental species introduction, but also because the transplants are going to walk or fly away after we transplant them, and that will make assessing their reproductive success and survival pretty difficult. And so relative to plants, we don't really see transplant experiments with animals. And so how might we test if a species range is limited by certain habitat requirements? Well, one possibility might be to test if a species' habitat requirements, dispersal capacities, and climatic niche are mismatched at their current range margin, right? Because even if the climatic environment is suitable at their range limit, and let's say dispersal isn't a limiting factor, if the organism doesn't have maybe the food resources it prefers, then it doesn't matter if those other requirements are met. We might imagine a range shift to be unlikely anyways. And so I'm wondering about the potential role of these more local habitat variables in our study system. And specifically, I'm curious about the role of nesting habitat. because we work primarily with species from the Megachilidae family, mostly within the genus Osmia, but also a couple of other genera. These species are solitary, so each female is working by herself. And the specific species we study nest in pre-existing cavities in dead wood, like this dead aspen tree here. And so presumably the presence of dead wood is an essential habitat requirement for these bees. And that stands in contrast to most other bee species, which are ground dwelling. Now we've been working specifically with species in the Southwest of the Colorado Rockies. And this is a region that has already experienced abnormally hot and dry conditions and is projected to experience more conditions like this in the coming years. And so we're wondering what the potential is for changes in the distributions of these species along elevational gradients, right? So if temperature conditions become a little too hot at lower elevations, maybe they're becoming just right at the higher elevations. And I will mention that past work from our study system has suggested that warmer temperatures are negatively associated with bee reproductive success. And so we might imagine that moving upwards to cooler conditions could be favorable for some of these populations. Now, the thing is that the species we study need dead wood to nest in. And so even if these higher elevation sites are becoming suitable in terms of temperature, if they're occurring beyond the tree line, then bees who need dead wood to nest in might be more limited relative to bees who nest in other substrates, let's say the ground. And we think this mismatch between favorable temperature conditions and availability of nesting resources is conceivable because we imagine that bee populations are going to be able to shift much faster than trees can. And so essentially the question is does the lack of nesting habitat limit the upper elevational distributions of these cavity nesting bees? And we're testing this essentially by putting up dead wood in the form of these wooden boxes with holes in them. We call them trap nests, and we put them at increasing distances and elevations from the tree line. And we have this design replicated over 3 slopes. This is what the setup looks like in the field. That's where our lab vehicle is parked. And our sites span about a 250-meter elevational gradient from the tree line. They look relatively similar in that they're all kind of an open meadow habitat with lots of flowers. And so these are photos of our lowest and highest elevation sites. And so every few days, we visit all the sites on the different slopes, and we check the trap nests to see how many are occupied. So you can see a mother bee in one of the holes there. And what we also do is conduct pollinator observations at each of the sites. And the idea here is to quantify the relative abundance of cavity and ground nesting bees. And so what we might predict is firstly for trap nest occupancy to decrease with increasing elevation, because to get to these trap nests, bees are having to disperse further from the tree line where their natal sites might have been. And secondly, in terms of bee community, we might expect both abundances of cavity and ground nesting bees to decrease with elevation, just because temperature conditions become more extreme at higher elevations. But if the lack of nesting cavities is indeed limiting cavity nesting bees, we might expect their abundances to decrease more rapidly relative to ground nesting bees. Okay, so here are some results. What we're looking at here is the number of occupied nests. So that's the number of holes that are filled in those boxes as a function of elevation. And so this is data from the past 3 summers for 3 slopes. And what we find is a significant negative relationship, whereas we go higher in elevation, further away from the tree line, we get fewer nests occupied in those trap nests. So that seems to fall in line with what we predicted in terms of trap nest occupancy. In terms of the bee community, so now we're looking at the total number of bees observed during each 30-minute survey we did as a function of elevation. And this is what we see. So So most strikingly, we might notice that there were just way more ground nesting bees. They're the ones in the brown relative to cavity nesting bees in the blue, regardless of elevation. And that was quite apparent even as I was doing the surveys. Just to help us visualize that better, this is the same data, but just plotted on two different panels. So note the difference in axis values here. So it does look like cavity nesting bee abundance might decline with elevation more rapidly than ground nesting bees, although it's difficult to visualize that given the different axis values. I will say that we did find a significant elevation by nesting type interaction, with the slope for ground nesting bees being slightly less negative compared to cavity nesters. But I think overall, whether this decline in cavity nesters is biologically significant is less clear, given how few of them we observed overall, regardless of elevation. Okay. So possibly our results align with this prediction about bee abundance, but not super clear. Okay, so going back to our original question, does the lack of nesting habitat limit the upper elevational distributions of cavity nesting bees? Perhaps we can say very tentatively, yes, at least to some extent. Certainly our results suggest that these cavity nesting bees are capable of moving upslope. And yet that seems to be only if we put up nesting habitat for them. And given that decline in occupancy, it's clear that they can only move upslope to a certain extent, above which they seem much less present to sites closer to the tree line, and certainly less abundant relative to ground nesting bees. And so it seems that, at least in our study system, maybe we do have a bit of a mismatch situation here. It seems that cavity nesting bees, at least the adults, are able to tolerate thermal conditions beyond their known range limits. They're able to get to those sites, but without us adding some kind of housing for them, they're missing something pretty important. And so perhaps, unless these bees are able to adapt and use different nesting substrates, we might imagine that upslope range shifts in the near future are going to be pretty unlikely. Before I end, I wanted to say that before science took place where my study sites were, there were people, the Ute people on this land, and they were forcibly removed in the 1800s in very unjust ways. And so this is something I try to think about a lot as someone who's really learned a lot from being in this place. There are lots of people, human people and non-human people, to thank for this project. And I will do my best to entertain questions, stories, and ideas.